Hey internet friends, you've probably heard this saying, time is a flat circle. That history cannot truly be measured by moments, centuries, or even millennia, but in cycles, each cycle representing a seemingly endless repetition of space and time. The infinite loop, forever spinning in the continuum unless a great change occurs. Which is why today we're going to talk about a cycle of decadence, decay, and destruction. A story of the Old Testament that's much more than some words printed on paper. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests the total destruction of these cities actually occurred. So let's discuss a whole new set of losers, a rather degenerate variety who signed, sealed, and were delivered straight to their destiny. The losers' history of Sodom and Gomorrah. When I was a child, I loved nothing more than a good story. One in which I could be immersed, imagining myself as one of the characters, watching the scenes play out across my mind long after the last words are spoken. But somehow, that sense of wonder and curiosity never translated to Sunday school or Bible study. The imagination was replaced by dread because those meant to teach the lessons from the good book managed to relay the most boring, stuffy, and difficult to understand version possible. The opposite is true, of course. The Bible is full of scandals, graphic depictions, and life lessons, and for the most part is pretty straightforward. So let me set the scene in the style of Charles Dickens by telling you a tale of two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. We're starting with the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, but we've got to fast forward through the creation of the heavens and the earth, and all the apple and garden business, and slightly past the Great Flood. And here we arrive at Abraham, a man who was called by God to pack up and leave his home to claim a new nation. Abraham is told one day by God that the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as a few of their neighboring towns, were going to be destroyed for their wickedness. Abraham asks God to hit pause on that thought, saying that there's surely some righteous, good-hearted folks to be found there. After all, Abraham's nephew, a guy named Lot, and his family lived there. So God strikes a deal with Abraham that if he can find a certain number of folks of the non-wicked variety, then the cities will be spared. To fulfill his end of the bargain, God sends two of his angels to go find Abraham's nephew. But to the angels' surprise, it's not Lot and his family who initially greet them, but rather a mob of obnoxiously vulgar and threateningly forward individuals. While it seems like a rather extreme reaction from the mob to immediately swarm the angels and demand to copulate with some strange flesh, it's mentioned earlier in the book of Genesis that the sons of God walked the earth and had sex with regular old women, and these women bore children. The Bible establishes that Sodom was a well-known place where the fallen angels would go and have sex with humans, leading to genetic impurity amongst the population. The fallen angels did this because it delighted them, knowing it would infuriate God and lead to the damnation of his creation. However, the angels who came to visit Lot weren't there for any funny business. They were heavenly messengers there to deliver God's message. The angels had initially planned to spend the night in the town square, but after their welcome from the townspeople, Lot was able to convince them to spend the night inside his house, which didn't make the mob too happy. Not at all. Gathering around Lot's home, they demanded to know about the angels who visited Lot and ordered him to bring the angels outside so that the mob could have sex with them. In a classic Old Testament twist, Lot walked outside and offered up his two daughters to the mob, but they were insulted by this offer and proceeded to threaten Lot. They wanted to ravish his guests, regardless of if his guests were willing or not. The angels weren't all about that. In fact, they teleported Lot back inside his home and struck the mob outside with blindness so they couldn't locate the door. The angels asked Lot if he had any other family living in town, and advised if he did to round them up and hightail it out of there because things were about to pop off, which is to imply that no more decent people within the city could be located. The area was consumed by sexual depravity and moral repugnance. As a result, God intended to destroy such an abomination. Lot warned his extended family, but they thought he was playing a prank or something, because they didn't leave the city with Lot, his wife, and his two daughters. Lot and his family were lollygagging, so the angels had to transport them out of the city and set them down, in what very much sounds like another instance of teleportation. The angels warned the family to hide in the mountains and not look back, otherwise they would be consumed. Lot didn't want to go to the mountains though. He wanted to go to a nearby town to wait out the apocalypse. So the angels basically said, okay, whatever. The angels were growing impatient. They were on the clock. God rained down fire and brimstone, otherwise known as burning sulfur, over Sodom and Gomorrah and other towns found within the plain, destroying all life there. The people living in the cities as well as any vegetation in abundance in the land. Even though she was warned not to, Lot's wife looked back at all the destruction as they fled, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Abraham witnessed Sodom and Gomorrah engulfed by fire, and said the scene was like smoke rising up from a furnace. So to summarize, these cities were chock full of such twisted and immoral people that God decided they had to be destroyed. But there was a redemption clause that was fully pursued but to no avail. The mob of Sodom and Gomorrah treated their guests like new warm bodies in the prison shower, waiting for the angels to drop their bar of soap. And when rejected, the townspeople intended to violently assault Lot and rape his guests. Later in the Bible, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah are expanded upon, explaining that the people were prideful, self-absorbed, and delighted in cruelty. The story of Sodom was never just about normal vanilla intercourse between men and women. Basically, these cities were comprised of a hedonistic group who cared little about consent and even less about the well-being of others. Their sense of entitlement, lack of self-control, and unbridled lust reduced the population to nothing more than ash and sulfur. The me generation was no more. A tactical nuke of sorts took them out. Lot's story ends rather uncomfortably. His wife died, and he and his daughters hid out in a smaller nearby town, only to escape to the mountains and live in a cave. It seemed like everyone else in the world was dead since they'd just witnessed their home and everyone in their town incinerated. And with no other viable males around, and in an attempt to preserve humanity, Lot's daughters devised an incestuous plot to get Lot drunk and have sex with him. And so both of Lot's daughters became pregnant with their father's child. With the concept of losers' history revolving around the idea that history is written by the victors, therefore implying that the history you're taught in school is not even close to the full story, it would be disingenuous of me to turn around and say with confidence that the Bible, the most read book in all of history, remained untouched throughout centuries of translations, especially in the clutches of the corrupt church. The church has demonstrated a pattern of weaponizing religion and using it as a form of control. A lie by omission is still a lie, and there's evidence that specific books have purposely been omitted from the biblical canon. These books contain important events and context, like the explanation of why God decided the Great Flood was morally necessary with all the genetic impurity and consequences of hybridization, as well as the story of how the angels fell from heaven. In this example, the context for the flood can be found in the book of Enoch. Enoch being a patriarch of the Old Testament and a man who walked with God, and great-grandfather to Noah. Enoch is referenced in the New Testament as well. Jesus even quotes Enoch, yet the book is left out of the Old Testament. Why? It was reported that up until the 4th century that the Book of Enoch was in circulation, only to be removed from the Christian canon and almost lost altogether until the 17th century. Corruption of the church should absolutely be acknowledged, especially when people pledge to navigate their lives by sermons and teachings. Sometimes those people become frustrated with the blatant hypocrisy of their teachers, and in modern times have turned their back on Christianity and looked for truth in another religion called science. So what does science have to say about the losers of Sodom and Gomorrah? Science has routinely demonstrated that biblical figures were real and the events described really did happen. There is actual scientific and historical evidence that proves that the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah did indeed exist, as well as the smaller surrounding cities, and were absolutely destroyed almost instantly, as portrayed in the book of Genesis, within the same time frame depicted in the Bible. Scientists, historians, and biblical experts have all maintained that the actual location of Sodom and Gomorrah was in or around the area of the Dead Sea, a salt lake between Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth at 1,400 feet below sea level. At 33% salinity, the Dead Sea cannot support normal types of life that are usually present in large bodies of water. Archaeologists have discovered artifacts in this area that suggest a fertile plain once existed there, one which sustained a prosperous civilization, which came to a sudden and abrupt end around 3,700 years ago. Excavations in the area unearthed pottery fragments that were melted into glass, meaning that the crystals in this pottery were formed in literally less than a second as a result of temperatures that would rival the surface of the sun. Not only that, but scientists noted evidence of a tidal wave of boiling hot salt that blanketed a projected 193 square mile radius that experienced high force winds, the combination of which is said to have instantly obliterated an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people before they were ever able to register what happened to them. While the Bible describes the cataclysmic event as God raining down fire and brimstone from the sky, both biblical experts as well as scientists have debated on the exact cause of total collapse. Theories include volcanic activity, earthquakes, a giant meteor, and even talk of thermonuclear explosion, which is particularly interesting within the context of the punishment of our losers, as the story and scientific evidence does support the phases of a blast, which would have been a flash of light, a pulse of thermal energy, then a pulse of nuclear radiation, followed by a fireball, an air blast, then of course, radioactive fallout. Plus, that would explain why the angels ordered Lot's family to hide behind the mountains, to shield themselves while God destroyed the cities. And when Lot's family didn't heed this order and Lot's wife stopped to look back at the destruction, she ultimately perished. That kind of instruction and consequence from not following it doesn't seem in line with volcanic activity or earthquakes, but you could make the argument for meteor explosion or even something as wild as a thermonuclear blast. The Bible says, after God rained down fire and brimstone meaning burning sulfur, the earth was rendered useless in the aftermath, which is reflected in the terrain bordering parts of the Dead Sea, where areas are covered in layers of ash, and sulfur balls with 96 to 98% purity are embedded in the terrain. Sulfur balls of this purity have not been discovered anywhere else in nature except for this location. In sulfur this pure burns hotter than hot. There's quite a bit of speculation as to the exact location of Sodom and Gomorrah within the Dead Sea region. To search for these cities, an English archaeologist who had been studying ancient maps and satellite images led a group of researchers equipped with diving specialists in a submarine down to the bottom of the Dead Sea, where they discovered the remains of an ancient settlement, with traces of structures under all the layers of salt. However, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were a metropolis, and a collection of cities that spanned a great region. So the scorched structures with distinct right angles found far away from the water likely belonged to these cities as well, buried under layers of ash with discernible features like windows and doors cut into the stone cliffs. There is even the ashen ruins of what appears to be a man-made sphinx, located at the foot of the ancient Masada fortress. The sphinx is a pagan idol with a woman's head and a lion's body, a lion human, otherwise known as a hybrid. So you don't need a submarine or a dive team to see that the events portrayed in the Bible actually did occur. You could literally power walk over there today and see it for yourself. The balls of pure sulfur and the remains of a civilization that ended abruptly. Regardless of how the Sodomites met their end or specifically where the towns were located, the point is that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not a fairy tale. It actually happened and was recorded in the most read book of all of history for a reason, as a warning. The thing about the past is that it really never goes away, no matter how far down it's buried. It doesn't matter if the past is hidden under layers of salt or ash, smoldering in some kind of book-burning ritual, crumpled up and tossed in a Vatican trash can, or censored on YouTube. During World War II, the Allies bombed the town of Hamburg, which history books would later refer to as the Hiroshima of Germany. Clearly inspired by the concept of biblical destruction, the Allies named this attack Operation Gomorrah. The bombing of Hamburg created a huge firestorm and a tornado of fire that reportedly killed nearly 40,000 civilians and injured over 100,000 more. From the ashes of World War II, the United States sprung forward into an era of prosperity and opportunity. The world was at peace for the most fleeting of moments, but tendrils of the past crept into the optimistic outlook of America's future. Wrapping around the new world built on top of lands as old as any, but this world was new to its inhabitants because there was hope. But unfortunately, evil still persisted, as it was not defeated in either of the world wars, or in the wars that would follow, as the United States soon found itself in a cycle of endless war. The same symptoms that plagued great empires of the past began to present as cultural decline. Ideological subversion, as well as the media's influence on society, has played a role in this. If you turn on the television and watch the news for an hour today, you'd probably see accounts of violence, terrorism, and war play out across your screen, only to be rivaled by the hypersexualization of stars and idols, and topped off with a few feel-good gender inversion stories. If you're lucky, you might catch a story on mothers empowering their children by dressing them in drag, and possibly some footage of those children dancing at bars while adults throw money at them. I mean, do you reckon they had a yield drag queen story hour in Sodom and Gomorrah? It's said that Sodom and Gomorrah's main sin was sexual immorality, and folks these days will make parallels to wherever they deem as a cesspool of sin and degeneracy. From Hollywood to Las Vegas to Washington, D.C., cities where folks don't even try to hide their sins because they're simply not ashamed. History tells us that when leadership of a society is unable to set a good moral example, the subjects of that leadership will follow suit. One of the biggest stories last year was the alleged suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, owner of an Israeli-operated blackmail island known for sexual depravity, where it was revealed that global elite, including high-level government officials, figureheads, and influential celebrities, had visited. How does this around-the-clock news story reflect on society as a whole? Does it reflect strength or decay? Of course, you don't have to look to these cities to find those who are struggling with self-control and addiction, particularly of the sexual variety. The World Wide Web and mass media has normalized adult entertainment viewership, and it's so popular that, in 1 year, more than 5.5 billion hours of adult entertainment was viewed on the internet's most popular adult website. To put that in perspective, that's over 600,000 years of content viewed over the span of a year. Top searches on the internet's most popular adult website include incest categories, which are always being promoted to viewers. And if they made an adult film out of the cave scene in Lot's story between his daughters, it'd probably do pretty well on there. All joking aside, a number of adult actors and actresses are in the business because of human trafficking. So the idea of finding pleasure from watching someone at what could be the lowest point in their life totally encapsulates the energy of Sodom and Gomorrah. God didn't destroy the losers of Sodom and Gomorrah. They had already destroyed themselves way before the fire and brimstone rained down. They destroyed each other by being selfish, only caring about themselves and their carnal desires. And they destroyed their souls by allowing spiritual forces of evil to enter their hearts and minds. Not only that, but the subtext of this story is that the Sodomites essentially allowed fallen angels to set up shop in their cities. And these fallen angels wanted nothing more than to subvert God's creation. They already got metaphorically spanked by God during the days of Noah, when the fallen angels were impregnating human women, resulting in genetic impurity and all these weird babies covered in red hair, or babies who were born with 2 rows of teeth who grew up to be giants. Like the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. And these days, genetic impurity has been taken to a whole new level with the transhumanist movement. With the promise of a stronger, healthier, and longer existence, science and technology is marketed to eager customers under the guise of a seemingly benevolent attempt at immortality. Science has the solution to the biggest problem society faces, the inevitability of death. The Bible says that man was created in God's own image. But what will be left after generations of genetic manipulation? This video is not describing where the losers of Sodom and Gomorrah went wrong, so that we may turn around and judge each other, but instead judge for ourselves and our families what is righteous and what is not. After all, one loser's history is another loser's future. Unless... What do you think, internet friends? You know I always look forward to reading your comments. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and supporting my channel on Patreon. Bye!